The hospital cafeteria at St. Michael's was the kind of place where fluorescent lights buzzed just loud enough to make your teeth ache. And the coffee tasted like it had been brewed sometime before the previous administration. Fiona Mercer had eaten here 4 nights a week for the past 2 years, always at the same corner table by the window that overlooked the parking garage, always with the same wilted Caesar salad and the same dog-eared paperback she never actually read. It was a Tuesday in late November, and outside the windows of the hospital, the Toronto skyline was doing that thing it does in winter, dissolving into grey, the CN Tower barely visible through the low cloud. Fiona was still in her scrubs. She'd come off a 12-hour shift in the ICU 20 minutes ago and hadn't bothered to change. Her hair was up in a bun held together by a pen she'd borrowed from the nursing station 3 weeks prior and never returned. She was 31 years old, and she looked, she suspected, approximately 47. She was stabbing at a crouton when the man sat down across from her. She didn't look up immediately. That was the thing about working nights in an ICU. You developed a very precise calibration for threats. Drunk patients, grieving families, the occasional colleague having a quiet breakdown in the stairwell. You learned to read a room in half a second, and whoever had just lowered himself into the chair across from hers didn't register as a threat. He registered as someone who was used to choosing where he sat. "That seat's taken," she said, still not looking up. "Is it?" Not a question. She looked up. The man was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that had no business being in a hospital cafeteria at 11:30 at night. He wasn't eating anything. He was just sitting there watching her with the particular stillness of someone who had learned patience the hard way. There were 2 men standing near the entrance who Fiona now registered with a slight lurch, both in black, both facing outward, both very deliberately not looking at anything in particular. "It's not taken," he said. "I checked. It's taken by the concept of me wanting to eat alone." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "Fiona Mercer," he said. "Registered nurse, ICU, 2nd shift rotation. Previously held a position at Vancouver General before relocating to Toronto 18 months ago. Plays piano. Studied music at McGill before switching to nursing. Has no outstanding debt because she paid off her student loans 14 months early." The crouton fell off her fork. She put the fork down. "Who are you?" "My name is Cormac Dray." He said it the way people say their name when they expect it to mean something. When it didn't visibly move her, something in his expression recalibrated, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. "I run certain operations in this city. Financial operations, primarily. You're going to need to be less vague than that, I'm aware." He glanced toward the window, and for just a moment his composure slipped in a way so small she almost missed it. A slight tightening around the jaw, a flicker of something behind the eyes. "I'm here because I need your help, and because I understand you're the best person for what I need." Fiona looked at the 2 men by the door. Back at him. "I'm a nurse." "Yes," he said. "I know exactly what you are." What Fiona was, specifically, was someone who should have stayed in music. She'd been good at piano. Not conservatory level, not prodigy level, but good in the way that made her high school music teacher stop what he was doing and just listen when she played. She'd gone to McGill on a partial scholarship. She'd played Chopin in the recital hall at 17 and made an old professor cry without intending to. And then her mother had gotten sick, and Fiona had spent 8 months watching nurses keep her alive, watching what their hands actually did in those quiet moments when doctors weren't present. And she'd made a decision that felt less like a pivot and more like a door swinging shut. She was not sentimental about it. She liked her job. She was good at her job. She did not spend shifts daydreaming about concert halls. But she still played sometimes in the small apartment near Cabottown, where she lived with her cat and a Yamaha upright that took up a third of the living room. She played late at night after the hard shifts, when she was too wired to sleep and too tired to think. Her neighbor had never complained once in 3 years, which she considered either a gift or evidence that the walls were thicker than they appeared. She thought about that apartment on the cab ride home from the hospital that night, after Cormac Dray had handed her a card with a single phone number on it and said, "Quietly, call me when you've decided," and walked out with his two shadows falling in behind him. She sat in the back of the cab with the card in her pocket and her hands in her lap and tried to be sensible about this. A sensible person would throw the card away. A sensible person would not be replaying the way he'd looked at her. Not like she was someone to be assessed, but like she was someone who had already been assessed, extensively, and found adequate, which was somehow more unsettling. A sensible person would note that the man had surveillance information on her that she hadn't given anyone, and would feel appropriately alarmed. Fiona was generally a sensible person. She did not throw the card away. She called 3 days later. Not because she'd decided anything. She told herself that clearly. She called because she wanted information, and because the alternative was spending the rest of her life wondering, and Fiona Mercer had never been good at wondering. The number rang twice. "I have questions," she said when he picked up. "I expected you would." He sounded like he'd been awake, like he was always awake. "Come to the address, I'll text you. Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. I haven't agreed to anything, I know," he said. 7 o'clock. The address was in the distillery district, one of the old converted brick buildings, the kind with exposed industrial bones and very expensive renovation work layered over them. A woman met Fiona at the door. Mid-50s, precise posture, the particular neutrality of someone paid to be invisible. She brought Fiona up 2 floors in a freight elevator that had been restored to the point of luxury, and led her into a room that was half office, half something else. Bookshelves that looked actually used, a long table covered in papers and maps, and at the far end a piano. A Steinway. A real one. Fiona stopped walking. "You play," she said, "not to the woman who'd brought her, but to the room in general." "My daughter did." Cormac Dray was standing near the window, his back to her, looking out at the courtyard below. He turned when she spoke. "Sit down, Nurse Mercer. I'll explain everything." His daughter's name was Sable. 23 years old. She was, Fiona gathered from the next hour of conversation, the sort of person who occupied a room differently than everyone else in it, vivid and sharp and constitutionally incapable of pretending she didn't know things. She'd studied criminology at U of T. She played Steinway the way Fiona played Yamaha, not for anyone else, just for the sound of it. She'd also, 7 months ago, started asking questions she wasn't supposed to ask. Cormac Dray ran, as he'd said, financial operations. What he hadn't said in the hospital cafeteria, and what he said now with the particular flatness of someone who'd decided honesty was tactical, was that those operations were not entirely within the purview of Revenue Canada. He ran a network, had done for 15 years, controlled, careful, and largely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Sable had looked. She hadn't found what he did. She'd found something worse. A competitor, a man named Hargreave, who ran a parallel operation out of Hamilton with significantly fewer scruples about collateral damage, who had been quietly working to absorb Dray's network for the past 2 years, and Sable, being Sable, had started pulling on threads. 3 months ago, she'd been in a car accident on the 401. She was alive. She was in this hospital, St. Michael's, floor 4, room 412, in a medically induced coma, because the neurological swelling hadn't resolved, and the attending physician wasn't willing to bring her out until he was confident the pressure had stabilized. "Your daughter is my patient," Fiona said slowly. "She has been for 6 weeks. He looked at her directly. "You are the nurse who has spent more time in that room than anyone else on the ward. You've adjusted her positioning 4 times outside of your scheduled checks. You played a recording of Debussy on your phone last Thursday and left it on the chair beside her bed for 40 minutes. Fiona said nothing. "You've been doing that," he continued, "because you believe it might help. Because you read a study out of Copenhagen on auditory stimulation in comatose patients, and you don't think the attending is taking it seriously enough." He paused. "You were right, incidentally. He's reconsidering." She should have felt surveilled. She did feel surveilled. She also felt, beneath that, something that was almost recognition. The particular sensation of being seen accurately by someone you hadn't given permission to look. "What do you need from me?" she said. Hargreave knows Sable found something. He doesn't know what exactly. Neither do I. He moved to the table, shifted a paper. She encrypted a file before the accident. Something she was building, evidence, contacts, I don't know the full shape of it. It's on a server that requires two-factor authentication using her biometrics. He stopped. "I need someone Hargreave doesn't know. Someone who can move through that hospital without raising attention. Someone who can." "Get close to her," Fiona said. "Yes, I already am close to her. She's my patient." "I know." Something in his voice just then was not the same as the rest of what he'd said. It was quieter. "I'm not asking you to do this because you're convenienced, Nurse Mercer. I'm asking because she trusts you. I've watched the monitors. Her heart rate changes when you come in." Fiona looked at the Steinway across the room. She thought about Sable, 23 years old, sleeping in a room she wasn't supposed to be sleeping in because she'd been brave enough, or stubborn enough, to pull on a thread no one else had noticed. She thought about the Debussy recording. "Tell me," she said, "exactly what you need." What she needed to understand first was the shape of the danger. Cormac Dray was meticulous about this. Over the next 4 days, he sent information in careful, structured pieces, documents that appeared to be medical files and were, underneath the surface layer, something else entirely. Names. Routes. A photograph of Hargreave that looked like it had been taken from a distance through glass in the grey February light of a parking structure. Hargreave was 61. He had the look of someone who'd been imposing once and was now simply large, a thickening around the jaw and shoulders that spoke of old muscle gone to something else. He ran his operation out of a logistics company in Hamilton. Legitimate on paper, plausible to any cursory inspection, invisible to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for. He had people inside the hospital. That was the part that made Fiona's stomach go flat and cold, not staff. She checked, methodically, over 2 nights, cross-referencing staff hire dates against the timeline Dray had given her. But a man who sat in the family waiting room on 4 twice a week, who signed in as visiting a patient on the 3rd floor named Bertrand, and who Fiona confirmed, on the 2nd Tuesday, did not actually visit anyone on the 3rd floor. He was there for proximity. He was watching the 4th floor from the stairwell. She didn't confront him. She filed that piece of information away with the precision of someone who'd spent 12-hour shifts learning to hold complicated situational maps in their head. She talked to Sable instead. She'd always talked to her patients, the ones who couldn't answer back. She'd read somewhere once that hearing was the last sense to go and the first to return, and she'd never needed much more justification than that. With Sable, she talked about small things. The weather, a brutal January freeze that had locked up the city, a Leafs game she'd caught half of at the bar down the street from her apartment, the particular aggravation of the hospital's coffee machine that had been out of service for 11 days. But she also quietly talked about music, about what it meant to choose something you were good at over something you loved, about the Yamaha in her living room and the Chopin she still played badly at 2 in the morning when the shift had been particularly hard. On the 19th day, Sable's finger moved. Not a spasm. Fiona had seen enough of those to know the difference. A deliberate micro-contraction, the first joint of the index finger directed toward the sound of Fiona's voice. She stood very still. Then she pressed the call button and waited for the attending. The attending's name was Dr. Yoon, and he was cautious the way that good physicians are cautious. Not timid, not obstructive, but precise. He ordered new imaging. He reviewed the pressure readings. He sat with the results for 2 hours before he came back to find Fiona charting at the nursing station and said, simply, "You were right about the auditory protocol." "I know," she said, which was not the politically optimal response but was accurate. He almost smiled. "We're going to start reducing sedation tomorrow, slow taper. I'd like you on shift when we initiate." She was. The slow taper was exactly that, slow. 4 days of gradual reduction, monitoring for signs of distress, of elevated intracranial pressure, of the dozen complications that could unfold if the process moved too quickly. Fiona was there for 3 of those 4 days. She adjusted pillows. She checked lines. She played the Debussy recording. And then on the 3rd day, something that wasn't Debussy. Something she'd queued up on a private impulse. A Bach partita. She'd played herself once in the McGill recital hall, badly, at 20 years old, because her professor had told her it was too ambitious and she'd wanted to prove something. She was not there when Sable Dray opened her eyes for the first time. She was in the supply room on the 2nd floor, her back against a shelf of saline bags, on the phone with Cormac Dray, telling him that the man in the waiting room had been replaced by a woman she didn't recognize, and that the pattern had changed, and that she thought the timeline was compressing. "He knows she's waking up," Dray said. Someone told him. A silence. "How long do you have?" "I don't know. Days, maybe less." Another silence, different from the first. "My daughter is the toughest person on that floor," Fiona said. "I need you to trust me." She didn't wait for him to answer. She ended the call and went upstairs. Sable was conscious but not yet clear-headed. The particular fog of long sedation, the slow reassembly of self. She looked at Fiona when Fiona came through the door, and her eyes tracked, which was what mattered. "Hey," Fiona said, keeping her voice level. "I'm Fiona. I've been your nurse." Sable's mouth moved. No sound yet. But her eyes stayed on Fiona's face with an alertness that was already too sharp for someone who'd been under for 3 weeks. "You don't need to talk," Fiona said. "You can just listen for now." She pulled her chair to the bedside. She was aware of the minutes ticking by, of the woman now stationed in the waiting room downstairs, of Dray and his people somewhere in the city, making whatever calculations they were making. She held all of that in the back of her mind, carefully, the way you hold a complicated chord, all the tension in the right places, not spilling over. "I know what you found," she said quietly. "Your father told me. Not everything, but enough." She paused. "I also know there's a man downstairs who's been watching your room since before you woke up, and I need you to tell me, when you're ready, not now, but when you can, where the file is." Sable's eyes didn't change, but her hand, lying loose on the blanket, contracted once. The same deliberate micro-movement Fiona had felt 19 days ago, I understand. It took 2 more days, 2 days of Dr. Ewan's careful taper, of physio coming in for short sessions, of Sable learning to hold a straw and then a spoon, of speech returning in fragments, a word, then 2, then a full sentence that came out hoarse and thin, but perfectly structurally sound. 2 days of Fiona scheduling herself onto shifts that weren't hers, of trading with colleagues using favors she'd been banking for a year, of watching the waiting room without appearing to watch it. On the 2nd evening, Sable held Fiona's hand while a physiotherapist rotated her wrist and said, very quietly so that only Fiona could hear, "Secondary account. The username is the date I started at U of T. The password is a Bach partita." Fiona kept her face completely neutral. "Which one?" she said. Sable almost smiled. It was the first time Fiona had seen that expression on her face, sharp, private, knowing, the ambitious one. She relayed the information to Dray that night, and the sequence that followed was not something Fiona was part of. She understood that clearly. This was where her piece ended, and his machinery took over. The data, the evidence, the legal architecture Sable had been building, brought to the surface and handed to people whose job it was to know what to do with it. She was, after all, a nurse. She clocked out at 11. She took the streetcar home through streets still frozen with January, and she unlocked her apartment and fed her cat and stood in front of the Yamaha for a moment without sitting down. Then she sat down. She played the Bach partita, the ambitious one, the one she'd played badly at 20 in Montreal, the one she'd been practicing in pieces for 11 years. She played it all the way through, slowly, at 2 in the morning in an apartment in Cabottown, with no audience but a cat who had already gone to sleep. She didn't play it badly. Hargreaves' operation collapsed in stages over the following weeks, the kind of quiet, methodical unwinding that doesn't make front pages but shows up in financial regulatory filings, and the sudden relocation of a Hamilton logistics firm whose director had abruptly taken an extended leave of absence. Fiona read about it in brief clinical terms in a document Dray's assistant forwarded to her with no accompanying message. The woman from the waiting room was not seen again. Sable was discharged on a grey Thursday in mid-February, walking out of St. Michael's under her own power, which Dr. Ewan described as ahead of schedule, and which Fiona privately described as entirely in character. She stopped in the corridor outside the ICU before she left, and looked at Fiona across the nursing station the way she'd been looking at her since she first opened her eyes, with that too sharp attention, that quality of taking in more than she appeared to. "The partita," she said. "You play it, I do now," Fiona said. Sable nodded once. "You should have always played it." She walked away down the corridor in her winter coat, her father 2 steps behind her, and the 2 men in black steady distance behind him, and Fiona watched them until they turned the corner, and then she picked up the next chart and went back to work. She was, after all, very good at her job, and now, finally, she knew it.